Hello, I'm Samuel Olafemshog, and I'll be speaking about data binding in Angular. So what is data binding? Data binding is a process that couples two data sources together and synchronizes them. Basically, it's a way of synchronizing data and two data sets together, usually in the component and one in the view or interface. So data binding is a way of communication. It makes our applications more interactive. Anytime we bind data, um, it's a way that lets the components speak to the view. So data is passed around in both directions. Angular, how does Angular handle data? Angular is a front-end framework, and it handles data dynamically by using data binding. Um, Angular components must have dynamic data functionality to make them more meaningful and valuable. Having static data may limit its usage, as the users will not be able to change their information. This means that in the case where something needs to change in an application and you've had coded it into the application, it becomes a problem when you need to change it. Imagine we have a name in the application that appears in a large application of, let's say, 50 places. To change that particular name and to update it, we would have to start changing, going into the code and start changing in those 50 places. But if the code was, that data was handled dynamically, you can change it in one place and it appears everywhere else. So what is Angular data binding? Angular data binding is a technique used to maintain and synchronize the components and the view model. Types of data binding. There are generally two types of data binding in Angular: the two-way data binding and the one-way data binding. The one-way data binding has subcategories, which are property binding, event binding, and string interpolation. So, and also, one-way data binding can be split into two: the component to view and the view to component. The component to view is the interpolation binding and the property binding. And while the view to component is the event binding. The style binding, class binding, attributes binding are ways of under property binding. One-way data binding. One-way data binding is a technique used to bind data from either side. That's from one side to the other. The flow of data is unidirectional. The critical data will follow only in one direction, either from component to view or from the view to the component. It is the most straightforward communication technique where the HTML template changes with the TypeScript code change. One of the types of one-way data binding is that interpolation binding. Interpolation binding displays the component property with their templates. Angular can directly take out the property names of the components and add those values within the browser. It further displays all the changes made by the developers. The interpolation binding performs various tasks, such as displaying properties, evaluating arithmetic expressions, displaying array items, calling methods, and then displaying the results. To shed more light on that, it means that interpolation binding, when you write an expression inside the interpolation syntax, evaluation can occur. You don't have to, if you wanted to make a calculation, you could just write the calculation and Angular will calculate that for you and print out the results. And it can display array items and carry out various other tasks. So interpolation binding, it's very useful in Angular. And how to interpolate data in Angular, we use the two curly braces. Like I said, so interpolation binding is a form of it's the type that goes from component to view or from component to template. So how it is written in the component is that you write two curly braces, then you write the figure you want to, or the value you want to interpolate. In this case here, in this our example, in our application, we want to display using myself and using John Doe as an example. I would say welcome John Doe when the person opens the application, but rather than typing in the components, welcome John Doe, what is written is that the first name and the last name is first of all defined in the components. The first name is defined and the last name is defined, as you can see on the left here in the component. Then in our template, when writing the code, we say welcome, then interpolate the value, first name, and also last name. And the outputs that we see on our screen will be welcome John Doe. So that is basically how interpolation works. As I also said, expressions can happen. So let's assume you want to make an addition. So within the curly braces, if you wrote 2 plus 2, rather in the output, what will come out to be 4. Another form of one-way data binding is property binding. Property binding in Angular helps you set values for properties of HTML elements or directive. Using property binding to do things such as toggle button functionality, set paths programmatically, and share values between components. Property binding moves the value in one direction from the component's property into a target element property. It is an exclusive one-way data binding where the properties of any DOM are bound with different fields. Property binding has the following syntax: the binding targets and the binding source. So we're binding a property, say an image or an attribute or something. So that attribute must be written in the angled brackets. And we set that value to the binding source. So in this example here, on the second line, property binding occurs. So we want to display an image in our application. So in the image tag, the SRC, the source property, is put in angle bracket and it is set to a variable that we have defined in the component, where the address of the image is defined. Then the third type of one-way data binding is event binding, which is the type that goes from the view to the component. It goes in the other direction, because when an action happens in the view, it sends that data into the application. So event binding basically lets you listen for and respond to user actions such as keystrokes, mouse movement, clicks, and touches. Event binding in Angular, this is how it is written. The event you want to bind is put in brackets, in curved brackets, and you define the events that you want to bind. It could be a click, it could be on mouse change or mouse over, whatever event you want to happen. Then the template statement, the method that you want to run once that event is once that event happens. So these are the various types of data binding with treated so far: interpolation and property binding with the angle brackets, and event binding with curved brackets, and two-way data binding, which we'll be speaking about next. So two-way binding is a type of binding that combines the attributes of event binding and property binding. What happens is that in two-way binding, a property is sent both from the component to the view and from the view to the component. So data flows or communication happens in both directions. This is bidirectional. The two-way data binding in Angular technique, in Angular, it allows data to flow to and from the components. Whenever a developer changes something within the view model, The changes are reflected within the elements immediately. Two-way data binding in Angular is handling in forms, and it usually happens in forms. So say an input, for instance, now you want to see what the user is typing, or you want the user to be able to see what he is typing or she is typing. You use two-way data binding. So whenever the person is typing something, the input is also being shown in the view. And on the other hand, when the user updates user details in the model, they are reflected in the view component. It has a syntax enclosed within. We have curved brackets inside angled brackets. This technique uses a particular directory known as the ng model. It's not exactly a part of two data binding Angular, but a part of Angular forms. The ng model used property binding and event binding in the backend. The value is bound using property binding. So, as I explained, a change in the view updates the model, and the model changes changes in the model updates the view. Now, this is an example here. Say you're searching for something, and in the input field, whatever you write is being shown on the screen by using the two-way data binding. Thank you.